But if we're going to look at the local church, so we've looked at national level, diocesan level, and this would be local level, so it's kind of like federal, state, and local rules. And a couple of things I just thought I'd point out and we'll have some conversation about. We're going to skip over we shall be known as the Cathedral of St. James. Here we go. Okay. So let's start here. We're going to start with the Cathedral Church, and why are we a Cathedral Church at all? It says, the Cathedral Church shall be the seat of the Bishop of Chicago, and as such, also the Diocesan Church for the use of the clergy and laity of the Diocese of Chicago, under and in accordance with the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Church in the Diocese of Chicago, and in particular shall be designated for the Cathedral Congregation, for the conduct of public worship and other appropriate ministrations and activities. Just lifting this up to point out, we kind of have this dual role here at St. James, where we are the cathedral for the whole diocese, but we are also a working, functioning parish in the diocese. That's interesting in comparison with, say, something like when Dominic Barrington went off to York Minster. If you go and you visit him at York Minster, you'll see it's a cathedral, but it's actually not a parish in the church. So its functions are pretty much all on the cathedral side of things, but it's not a local parish church, whereas we function in both those ways. That's much more American. A lot of our American cathedrals are usually the cathedral and also a working parish at the same time. So it means we'll have a lot of diocesan services, ordinations, big regional confirmation services. You'll see we will usually be the place where we'll put on special state funerals for people, like when we did Bishop Montgomery not that long ago. It's held here, and it's a gathering and a worship service of the whole diocese. That's as opposed to day in, day out, Sunday mornings, like we're going to have today, which is it's our local parish service. Outside of worship, it means we're going to put on functions here, which are diocesan in nature. So if we're planning on holding real soon, a gathering for the Sanctuary Committee of the Diocese of Chicago is going to come and hold a Know Your Rights seminar for refugees and immigrants. That's going to be an open invitation to the whole diocese. Anyone in the Diocese of Chicago will be welcome to come to that. It's going to be seen as very diocesan level, as opposed to if we were just a parish and we would probably just promote it and open it up only to our own members, as opposed to, say, this event here. It's the forum, it's the parish forum, the Sunday school like you have in any parish. It's not. This would not generally be something that would be open to everybody in the whole diocese to come to this function, because they're going to be at their own parishes doing this. Does that all make sense so far? Just pointing out that by its constitution, we have this sort of dual role. Where that comes into play is a couple of things. We have what's called a cathedral chapter instead of a vestry. Functionally, they're very similar in a lot of ways. I'll point out the difference in a moment. A bunch of y'all have even been on. I see a bunch of y'all have been on the chapter. So this talks about, so remember the national church said there shall be a vestry. And that vestry shall be made up of members of the parish who are voting members, and we will have democratic governance in our churches. But what it doesn't say in the national church is how often the vestry has to meet, how many members should be on the vestry, how are they chosen. And so when you get into the local, you'll see here we have local rules on how it will be formed. And it says we will have regular monthly meetings. July and August will not typically be held. That's not true anymore. We always meet July and August. Typically held unless chapter or the dean or executive committee determines that the business requires those meetings. So we pretty much always have them, because we always have business that we're conducting in July and August. Interestingly, one of the differences of being the cathedral chapter is that the president and person who presides over the cathedral chapter is the bishop. And in the absence of the bishop, the dean would be the person that is acting in that sort of vice presidential role over the cathedral chapter. In the absence of the bishop, the dean will preside over the meeting. Now, functionally, the bishop never comes to our vestry meetings. Right? The bishop has other things going on and is perfectly happy to here locally let us work on the governance of St. James as a parish. But it's interesting to note that technically the bishop is the person that's the head of the cathedral chapter and has the right to preside over it if she so chose. In another diocese, just saying Diocese of Texas, for example, where I was before here, the Bishop of Texas has a very active role in the cathedral chapter there, always presides over the meetings there. So just difference from one place to another. Here we have what part of what makes it a cathedral chapter as opposed to a vestry is rather than the vestry, which say you may be in a vestry where they may, by their local bylaws, they may say, we have 9 members of our vestry. And we elect them at the annual meeting that we have every year to say, here's the 9 people we're going to elect, usually for 3-year terms. So we'll usually elect 3 of them at a time in cycling 3-year terms. You may have 12 people in the vestry. So it may be 4 people every 3 years that you're in a rotation of. I have worked in a church where we had 21 members on the vestry. Oh, wow. That is too many members. That is too many members. It's hard enough to get 9 people in a room with one another at the same time. If you've ever tried to plan a meeting to have 9 people at the same time, you can already imagine how hard it is to get 21 people available at the same time. Around a table, trying to have a conversation where you can't even hear the people on the other side of the table because they're 14 people away from you. So I have been on a vestry with 21 members. It's too many members. But like 12 or 15 is pretty common. Here at St. James, because we're the cathedral, we elect our own members to be on the chapter, but there are also people from outside of St. James Parish who are appointed by the bishop to also serve on the chapter, appointed or elected. And again, that'll be up to local rules. So some places the bishop may say, I'm going to put the people I want on there, because we're not just a parish, right? We're the cathedral for everyone. So there have to be some people in the room who are thinking beyond the walls of our church and thinking, what does the wider diocese need of us? And so it'll typically be like 12 members that we're electing from the local community, but there'll be 3 outside members who were brought in from other parishes. Yeah, great.
So are there non-St. James members of our chapter?
Yes. So we have I was gonna say, I think 3 off the top of my head. So Ann Reba, Eileen Shanley Roberts, and Morris Charles are all on right at the moment, representing outside of St. James. You may remember Chris Griffin was one of those outside members of chapter until he started working at the cathedral, and we needed a different outside member because he was now an inside person.
So it doesn't say they have to be Episcopalians, right?
Interestingly, again, that would be sort of a local thing. Here it would be Episcopal members of St. James. So in order to be on our vestry, you would have to be what's called a confirmed communicant in good standing, which essentially means confirmed, meaning you are theologically formed, you've had confirmation and have made a mature commitment to your faith. Communicant, meaning you show up sometimes and receive communion. And in good standing usually is kind of code for you are a giving, contributing member. So in order to be on the vestry, this makes sense, right? In order to be the person serving on this lay board governing the church, you need to be a member, a theologically formed, present, attending, and contributing member to the community. we don't generally have a lot of problems with having to turn people away because they're not a confirmed communicant in good standing. Because if you're coming to us to say, I'd like to be on the vestry, you probably already are all of those things. And I will say at St. Stephen's, I had a great person in the church, though, who had been there for years and years, attended every Sunday, very engaged, giving, pledging person, but had just never gotten around to being confirmed. We actually did elect him to the vestry, but then quickly had the bishop confirm him in the next confirmation service before he could start serving. So it can be rectified as well. Let's see. But in some dioceses, for example, when I was in the Diocese of Indianapolis at St. Paul's, at that time we had a youth representation. We had a youth representative who was, I think, 16 years old and always sat in on vestry meetings, got chosen just like everybody else, but to kind of make sure we didn't lose sight of the youth demographic, youth representation. At one point we actually had to your point about being members, we had a non St. Paul's chronically unhoused person who usually attended our meals and went to our food bank and all of that. And we asked him if he would please be on our vestry, to sit on our vestry and help us to make sure we're having a mindset toward outreach and those in need around us as well. In some dioceses and in some parishes, by their bylaws, he would not have been qualified because he was not a giving member. He wasn't pledging to the church. So that's going to be very local, is decide how exactly you structure that vestry. All right. And essentially, this is democracy at work. When we go to pass resolutions, there needs to be a president that's presiding. That's the bishop in our case. A vice president, who is the dean, who presides over the meeting when the bishop is not present. We have to have a secretary, a person whose job it is to take the notes. And we here at St. James will usually have our chancellor present. We have a volunteer chancellor in our case. It's Erin Moss. She's been on Cathedral chapter. She is an attorney, so she sits in on the meetings, just as we are making decisions about things that sometimes may have legal ramifications or legal considerations. She's not paid to do that. It's simply her services that she offers to the cathedral to make sure that that angle of things is being considered. A treasurer who likewise sits in on the meetings and is making sure we're thinking about the financial considerations of everything that the chapter is doing. And then when it comes time for voting on things, it's a majority rules, democracy in action voting. So if we were to put forward an idea, say in this case, in Lent, we have chosen that we're going to take a collection in Lent that's going to benefit, we're dividing it up. This is benefiting two different Episcopal partners with whom we're in relationship with and who are doing work for migrants and refugees and the LGBT community. And we will be dividing the offering during Lent to those communities. So it's the Sanctuary Task Force and St. Martin's work. In order to take that collection and authorize that we would take that collection and use it for that purpose during Lent, it was put to a vote of Cathedral chapter. And if it was an 8-7 vote in favor, then we would do it. It's a majority rules system. Most of the time in reality, we don't tend to like having a divided chapter who's in such disagreement that we're voting 8-7 on something. We don't want it to kind of be like you see in Congress sometimes, where it comes down to who has the one extra vote they need to get their way, and everybody else loses and doesn't get their way. That's democracy. The majority is ruling. Right? Our own local way we try to do it is we try to be in conversation and come to some consensus. So generally, if we were so divided over whether or not we were going to give to help migrants and refugees, If there was deep division over that, and it was going to come down to an 8-7 vote, we probably would discuss it further before we would just be putting it to a vote and saying winner takes all. So most of the time, we will have discussed something, come to consensus, and the majority of the votes end up being unanimous. We unanimously voted to make Lisa Hackney James Dean of the Cathedral, so it wasn't an 8-7 vote, for example. We probably would have given it more thought if we were so divided in that way. So instead, it was unanimously decided. Does that all make sense? Yeah, great.
So there you have a president, a vice president, a treasurer, and 1 or 2 wardens. So what's the difference between a warden and just a regular chapter member?
This is why I'm putting this up, so people can read the fine print and make sure I'm not missing things.
Yeah.
We also have wardens. So you may recall in the national church canons, it said you have to have a vestry and you have to have wardens. And it doesn't say anything about how the wardens are chosen. You'll have a senior warden and a junior warden. And in most vestries, and this actually we'll talk about this in our bylaws, in most vestries, the senior warden is considered to be the chief lay person. Imagine it in a kind of a Speaker of the House capacity. First among equals, just gets 1 vote the way everyone else gets 1 vote, but the Speaker of the House has a special role in organizing and presiding at the meetings. In a lot of churches, if the rector is not present, the senior warden will frequently be the one running the meeting.
Not the president.
Well, in that capacity, you'd have, arguably the rector would be the president, the senior warden could be like the vice president who's running things. Lots of times if you're in a church and you're in an interim where there's nobody in charge, there's no priest, rector, typically the senior warden is seen as the person who is running the parish, who's in charge of the parish, in consultation with the vestry. In a lot of churches, the junior warden kind of serves as vice warden and is the person that if anything were to happen to the senior warden, the junior warden will become the new senior warden, like president, vice president. In some churches, the junior warden is very deliberately chosen to be the next senior warden. You'll see we did that here. So Nicole Spencer was the senior warden, while Susan Fickling was the junior warden, and she spent a couple of years working with Nicole. So for a smooth transition. I like that because there's a smooth transition. So then when Nicole goes off as senior warden, Susan is becoming the new senior warden, and has had some years working with the previous senior warden. I was going to say administration, maybe don't refer to it like that. But, and now Alan Moy has become the new junior warden. It doesn't guarantee that now don't go to Alan and say, now you have to be our senior warden. But it does make sense. We're moving in that direction of helping form him and prepare him and work with the senior warden so that he would be very well prepared when it's Susan's time to rotate off. He would be in the very good position to continue for continuity as the new senior warden. That makes sense so far? Yeah, okay. And in some churches, the senior warden is often seen as having a particular portfolio, usually over say finance and administration of the parish. And sometimes the rector will very much not have a role to play in the finance. They'll just kind of step away from the business side, let the senior warden run the business side of things. That tends to be more common in smaller parishes where there's a lot of turnover in priests and not a lot of continuity. It makes sense to have a senior warden who's there doing that. In some of those cases, the junior warden tends to be the person who's over the building maintenance, buildings and grounds. And so would be the person who's really looking over facilities. Now, a large church structure like St. James, we have a finance person who's on staff, and we have a buildings and grounds person who's on staff. So we're not relying on the senior warden and junior warden to be the people who are arranging for a lawnmower to come out and cut the grass and making sure that they, balance the bank statements every month. We're not usually asking our senior warden and junior warden to do that because we have a larger staff doing that. And then in a really small church, You may have the senior warden may be the one that's getting up and presiding at morning prayer a lot of Sundays. And the junior warden's the one who's not hiring the landscaper, but getting out the lawnmower. It's the junior warden's job to cut the grass every week so that the grass looks good for Sunday. That tends to be the very small churches, where the junior warden and senior warden are very, very active in the day-to-day running of the parish. Whereas a much larger system like St. James, they start to operate a little bit more like a board of governors in that way, like an advisory board. But so you'll see, so the National Church says you have to have a senior warden and a junior warden. It doesn't say what those roles have to be. Those tend to get defined at the local level. Yeah, Lance.
Chancellor, is that always a legally minded or trained person, or it just happens to be that? Is that what's the chancellor?
I suppose the person wouldn't have to be a licensed attorney. It makes sense to have your chancellor be somebody who's trained in the law and licensed in that way.
What's the intent of that position or that role on the
really not a voting member, just not a voting member of the chapter, but the person who sits in on the meetings and helps provide legal advice.
I see, so it is meant to be like a legal.
Yeah, it's an advisory role. And you'll see, so some churches, the senior warden will be chosen by the priest. And in some in those churches, sometimes the junior warden is chosen by the lay people. So it kind of mirrors that, like both the clergy and the laity have a role to play in the governance of the church, and the rector gets to choose their senior warden, and then the vestry gets to choose their junior warden, and kind of be like a counterbalance to make sure that the clergy and the laity are both represented. Again, that tends to be in smaller churches I've seen in my experience, and it depends on the diocese. In Indianapolis, when I was in the Diocese of Indianapolis, the rector got to choose the senior warden, but the vestry got to vote and elect the junior warden. So each people, and sometimes they're even known as the rector's warden and the people's warden. I've seen that referred to sometimes too. You can see how the dual representation is nice, but you can also, I think, see how it can be kind of dividing as well. This is my warden, and that's your warden, and our wardens must do battle to see which one will win, and like that's not what we want. So here, as opposed to a structure like ours, where we will frequently have the dean will ask somebody to serve as the senior warden and the junior warden, but it will be ratified by election. So that's an attempt to kind of make sure there's still dual role. You still have clergy and lay engagement, but not maybe in quite as divided of a way, but more in a working together kind of way. Yeah.
I thought, well, this is from experience 15 years ago, but it's also important to know, I think, that in between vestry or chapter meetings, the wardens kind of form a working group with the dean and the director of administration. They meet frequently in between. It's not doing things behind the chapter's back, but maybe working out details of something that was
right.
to
There may
be
be things
presented.
that come up that you can't wait until the next meeting next month.
Yeah, and also the wardens control the checkbook.
Right, have a checkbook, yes, as well. So it's very common in churches to have, checks have to have the rectors and the senior warden's signatures on things. That's pretty common. But you make a good point. Which is to say, if there's a burst pipe and we need to call the plumber and there's water pouring down into the Great Hall, we don't want to say, well, we'll cover it in 3 weeks when we have the next vestry meeting. That's when we'll discuss whether or not to hire a plumber and how much we'll pay for it. That doesn't make any sense. So usually between those meetings, like you said, we have an executive committee. It was referred to in here as the executive committee, which is frequently would be the dean and the senior warden and the junior warden, who can come together for a much quicker decision between things to say, we need to hire a plumber right now. you know, what do you think? We authorize this person, and they say yes, go, so we can get the plumber in right away rather than waiting until the next vestry meeting. Although in our case, like frequently, there's also an emergency contingency to say, if you're going to spend anything less than $500, just go and do it and let us know afterwards. But if it's going to be more than that, come and check first. And then, so it's scaled by a certain amount so that we're not calling, it wouldn't make sense to have to call the senior warden and junior warden together for an emergency meeting every time you had to buy a light bulb. Let's say $2 light bulb, or what, they're more like $20 now, I guess. $20 light bulb, $20 light bulb, don't check with us first, just get the light bulb. Maybe $700, $800 for a plumber, maybe call and check real quick first, and we'll say, yes, go, do it. If we're gonna do something, say, like buy 65 East Huron Street, we'll do that in the whole Cathedral chapter, we'll get together before we sign the check for that, right? If that kind of makes sense how that's divided up. But yeah, that's a good point, thank you, David, that's a good point. All right, I was gonna move on to, this is the Cathedral part. Okay, here's what I was looking for next. The bishop.
Just one more question
Yes.
before,
Before we get to
am
the
I
bishop.
correct in understanding anyone can attend a vestry meeting? They're open to the whole congregation?
Right, so, yep, it's not a private, closed-door meeting. Anybody can sit in and attend. I find, but would usually not be a voting
Right.
member, and would have to be granted voice in the meeting. So it's not uncommon for us to invite somebody to join us to speak on some topic, like the meal ministry. And we've invited them to come and speak at the meeting. They still wouldn't get to place a vote on, say, the distribution of funds for the feeding ministry, but we'd invite them in. And anybody could come and sit in on the meetings. It's not typical. I was gonna say, the last person I know that just took it upon themselves to sit in on a vestry meeting just for fun was me. So, and I haven't seen one since then. That was 20 years ago. I sat in on a vestry meeting for fun, and everybody said, "Why are you here?" Because I thought it was really interesting. Now, it could happen that if they have to discuss some sort of matter of some security, they could vote to say, we need to go to executive committee here, and we'd ask anybody that's not a voting member to leave the room. And then they would, if there was a matter of some like sensitivity that had to be discussed that was confidential, but then after they go back out of executive session, any visitors would be allowed to come sit back in as well. We don't deal a lot in national security secrets, but that could be the case if they ever were in a place where they were deciding we have to talk about something just among the voting members. But outside of that, outside of voting to go into executive session, you're right, anybody can sit in on a chapter meeting.
I was gonna ask you that though, if anybody ever does, because I've been on church council in the Lutheran church, and I've been a couple of times in the past, and it's a very similar setup, and I've never had anybody that wasn't a voted member of church council or of the
Right,
vestry.
well,
So,
and
it
the
doesn't have a
minutes,
life.
the meeting minutes are open as well, so the meeting
Yeah.
minutes are not confidential.
Transparency.
There's transparencies to say, anybody has access to the meeting minutes, so you
The
can
minute
see
you
what
tell
was
them they
discussed.
can't come,
They want
They
to come.
will.
then there's an issue.
Well, right,
If
and,
they say you can come and no one comes.
and remember, like, part of what we're trying to move into here is the heart of a democratic,
Right.
is the heart of a democratic system, but like representative democracy, you all are electing a bishop, you all are electing who to have as your dean and your vestry and your wardens, and you do have the ability to then follow through and watch what they're doing. So it's representative democracy, whereas we don't call people, we don't call the whole church every time we have to have a vote on which plumber we're gonna hire. We've entrusted that into the vestry to make those decisions on our behalf. But we will have an annual meeting. I think it's jumping ahead a little bit, but you remember at the end of January, it says in our bylaws, at the end of January, we will hold an annual parish meeting, Now that meeting will be, everyone is welcome to come to, and that would be the meeting where we do things like vote on who we are putting on the vestry.
Have you ever had a general meeting where there are dissenting votes, people that don't agree with what's gonna happen?
I have not had personally a lot of experience with those. I've heard stories. I've heard stories about parishes where people were getting together with one another and having secret house meetings and kind of like getting a faction and saying,
Yep.
we really disagree with the direction that this church is going, and we're gonna stage a protest, or we're gonna submit some resolution at the annual meeting to have the priest thrown out, or to sell our church, or some big dramatic thing. And it's very contentious and dividing people. And I've heard horror stories of
We have
like,
that.
yeah, okay, so I've heard these stories of,
Yeah, just curious if the cathedral ever did.
not in my knowledge, although I'm not an expert in the whole 190-year
Well,
history.
fair enough.
I was gonna say, maybe David has heard one, no, okay.
I wasn't here that long.
No, well, no. More in that you know a lot of the
recent
history, not that you were there for it. I had a colleague who was in a church where people were so unhappy with the job the vestry was doing that they staged in protest that enough people were going to leave the church to drive the church into insolvency unless the whole 12 members of the vestry resigned. And they were there at that meeting, I kid you not, there weren't enough people who wanted to be on the vestry, so they passed around a hat. And they drew 12 names, and those were the new 12 members of the vestry. So that kind of thing can happen. It's not really the best way to govern your church, and so I would say that's part of why we try not to do it that way. We try to make it so that everybody feels like they have a voice, and there's a process for lifting up their voice and having it be considered, and then having things put to a majority vote. And sometimes somebody may not get their way, and they may say, well, if I'm not going to get my way, I'm leaving this church. But it's not really in keeping with the spirit of democracy. Democracy doesn't work if you only stay in if you get your way, right? Democracy only works if sometimes you're in the minority, but that's how the vote goes. And sometimes you're in the majority, and that's how the vote goes. But we're all in on this being a group decision. And whatever vote we come to, sometimes we struggle with this a little bit, particularly now, like nationally. This is something we're struggling with. But the idea of saying, we're all gonna vote on this together, and whether or not I get my way, I'm supportive of this was the will of the congregation, and I support that. That's the spirit we're trying to keep it in. Yeah.
Perhaps a lot of this disagreement and revolution and rebellion might have happened during the time of the Great Schism of our church, during concerning the issue of LGBT.
Sure.
So there were a lot of churches during the reign of the presiding bishop Story.
Yeah.
Yeah, she had to deal with a lot of this issue.
Yeah, there have been
Churches left the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
They voted to leave the Episcopal Church and join some other denomination.
And we had to discuss the legality of that and everything, right? There have been periods through the history of the Episcopal Church. I'm very mindful of the Great Division over slavery in the 1800s. You will see, if you go to a lot of Episcopal churches, and there'll be a little cornerstone and it will say, founded 1860. There's a reason so many churches, Episcopal churches, were founded 1860 to 1863, and that was the Civil War. And you had half the congregation was pro-slavery and half the congregation was anti-slavery, and they divided into two separate churches. When I was at St. Paul's in Indianapolis, St. Paul's was on the No, I was on the anti-slavery side of the church, and half the congregation left and formed their own church, founded in 1860. You did see, particularly at the ordination of women, that was a lot of division. 100 years later, we're talking now about the 1970s were a great time of debate over the ordination of women in the church. And we nationally decided to put it to a vote, and voted, not without controversy and not without a lot of years of work, but eventually did put it to a vote and voted by majority to say that women shall be ordained ministers in this church. And some people did say, well, if I can't get my way, I'm leaving. Some whole congregation said, if I can't get my way, I'm leaving, and I'm going to go form my own church. And a lot of those joined what we would think of now as the Anglican Church in America, not the Episcopal Church, but the Anglican Church in America, that would leave over the ordination of women. And then we saw it a couple decades later over LGBTQ inclusion, over doing same-sex marriage and the ordination of LGBT clergy. Again, put it to a vote, and the majority said, yes, we are doing this, yes, it shall be allowed, but we did have whole congregations. We had a couple of whole dioceses left, actually. So, like, infamously, the Diocese of Fort Worth, the bishop, in Quincy, yeah. I'm thinking of like Bishop Eicher or David Eicher, who is the Bishop of Fort Worth, that said, I'm leaving and I'm taking my diocese with me, including the parishes that did not want to leave, but saying, I'm moving the diocese. And it led to great legal debate over, can you do that? Can you leave? Can you leave the church? And it's okay to Bishop Eicher say, Bishop Eicher, you can leave. You can't take a diocese with you, including the people, against their will.
And the buildings.
And the buildings, and who will own the buildings? And saying, but you don't own the buildings. The buildings are owned by the church, and you are leaving the church. And his argument was, I'm not leaving the church, I'm taking the church with me. And this had to go all the way to the United States Supreme Court. So we don't have time for a debate on separation of church and state for this, but it did go all the way to the United States Supreme Court that eventually did rule that the Diocese of Fort Worth did have the right to take the whole diocese out of the church and take the property and the parishes with them, whether or not the people in the parishes wanted it. And about 6 parishes in the Diocese of Fort Worth decided to leave and stay behind because they wanted to remain in the Episcopal Church. And they got reintegrated into the Diocese of North Texas, at that time is what they called it. Because the Supreme Court had said the Diocese of Fort Worth can take themselves out and remove and be not part of the Episcopal Church anymore. But that was very uneven. There were lots of other places, lots of other churches where the courts ruled the other way and said, you can leave the church, but the property still belongs to the church. So it really depended on which judge you got. It was very interesting. And then what the appeals process was, and then eventually the Supreme Court and how they rule. And it was very uneven from place to place. And you'll see here the Diocese of Quincy then got the parishes that did not leave and joined the Anglican Church of North America. The parishes that remained got reabsorbed back into the Diocese of Chicago, reintegrated back in, because it was only a handful and it didn't make sense to remain their own diocese. So they got reintegrated into the Diocese of Chicago. But that's an example of where, despite our best efforts to try to legislate at the national level and at the local level, we try to legislate and say, we have a system for resolving our differences. But then sometimes, the written word, you can't legislate your way out of a conflict on some occasions. Slavery was just too much of an issue. People were not willing to just put it to a vote and say whichever side wins, and we'll go with that. And it was the same way with ordination of women and the LGBT inclusion. There were so many people that said, I'm not willing to abide by the majority. And so we do our best. We do our best to uplift democracy. We do our best to uplift a place here at St. James where we put something like making Lisa our new dean, we put it to vote. Now I'd like to think, hypothetically, if we aren't doing our democracy well, if we aren't nurturing that and living into it well as a community, you could see half the congregation saying, I don't approve of this, I'm leaving and forming my own cathedral down the street. But that, I think I would say that would have been a failure of our process. To just say, like it or not, the majority wins, we don't care what you think. But that's not our process. We really took a lot of time to say, we care about doing this together. And even if at the end of the day, everybody doesn't get their first choice, we hope everybody is heard and they feel like we understand and we care about them. And we hope they understand it. In democracies, sometimes we don't all get our way every time. And for the most part, I think we do a pretty good job of that here. I mean, that's why you don't see schism after schism here at St. James. I only have a couple of minutes, so I do just want to make sure I point out the bishop part, just because it's different here than it is in other places. And this is going to be interesting for us, particularly when it comes to our acquisition of St. James Commons, the cathedral in St. James Commons, that would be moving from ownership of the diocese to the ownership of St. James. You'll notice in our bylaws that this is still the cathedral. It will still be the bishop's cathedral. The bishop may occupy the cathedral. Well, it takes on a different tone, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
The bishop may occupy the cathedral whenever he or she desires, with or without notice to the dean. I don't think it means it in a negative sense. It really doesn't. The bishop may preach and celebrate and conduct other services in the cathedral, and sometimes she may desire, by arrangement with the dean or upon reasonable notice to the dean. The bishop may be entitled to use the cathedral church for other general purposes by arrangement with the dean or upon reasonable notice to the dean. And the bishop is the one who ultimately installs the dean. And any of the canons, and the canons of the dean, who will be clergy in the cathedral, with the approval of the bishop. So, this is something we will work with any property management company that we're working with to help them understand that yes, in a traditional sense, we would say, we are the owners of the building, and the bishop is our tenant in the building that we care about, and we want to make sure her needs are met, but she is a tenant, and we will decide when the bishop can use the cathedral and the offices. Except, that's not the polity of our church, which is to say, if the bishop comes in and says, I'm holding a service here, you have to cancel that concert, I'm holding a service here, we actually don't, like maybe legally as the landlords, we would have the right to say, no, you can't kick out this concert for your service. But the polity of our church is the bishop does have the right to do that, even though they are a tenant and we are the landlord. So I'm bringing this up just to say, we need to make sure we are good partners with each other.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we are in good conversation with one another and thinking about each other's needs. The last thing we would ever want is a situation. We don't want a situation where the bishop feels like there would be conflict over using her cathedral whenever she wants to use her cathedral. And I know that she also would take seriously that since we're over the management of the building, that she would make sure that she is paying close, careful attention to how we are using the building. So there's the rules as they're written on paper, but we are going to need to make sure that we are good partners in working with each other together on this. And I know our dean and our bishop do care about being very attentive to that and making sure that they will work together on how do we do this well. If it gets to a place where they're having a fight over who gets to use the space, that means we failed in the process earlier to make sure that there was good discussion about it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is there a process in the works to revise and elaborate on this Article 8? Given that we're going to a very
I mean, it's an interesting point, is to say, like, maybe we should revise this. But more than this just being our bylaws, it's also the polity of our church to say the bishop is in charge. So what do you do when the dean is the landlord of the building that the bishop is in, but the bishop is still the bishop of the dean, right? And so we could, you're right, we can sort of massage these bylaws, especially if we were trying to legislate a way to resolve conflict so it doesn't happen. But we are still an Episcopal church. Yeah.
I think unique to St. James was that murky relationship between the diocese and the parish about the ownership of the property. And for years there were serious debates about maintenance and who does what part of the building when and who pays for it.
Right.
And even more recently, when this building was created, there were terrible. There were intense discussions about things like the kitchen, who uses it, how is it going to be created, what color is the front door going to be, what does the landscaping look like.
Maybe put a Christmas tree in the lobby.
So I mean, there were these serious discussions for years and years.
Yeah.
Those debates are ongoing.
And those things, yeah. I mean, I will say I have a lot of experience working on sort of like shared use agreement type work and memoranda of understanding. I've worked at several places where we had a school associated with our church, and the school board and the vestry are standing out there counting whose cars are using the driveway more, so that at repaving time we know who has to pay 37% of the repaving costs versus 38% of the repaving costs. I guess what I would say on that is, if you've gotten to the point where your representatives are standing out there counting who's using more cars on the driveway, you have failed earlier in the process to make sure that you've established a working relationship. So I would hope that's part of, and I know this is part of the process that the diocese and the cathedral are working on now, is to make sure we have good structures in place to talk about how we do things and our differences over all the best meaning purposes, right? Whether or not there's a Christmas tree in the lobby or not, and who gets to decide that under what circumstances. Before it becomes a battle between the cathedral chapter and the standing committee of the diocese, we should have an earlier process for how we talk about what we want to do in this phase. So, I'm going to keep running you all and everything, but thank you all so much. I hope this has created more questions than provided answers.